Before audiences ever stepped into a theater, The Expendables 3 had already suffered a wound few blockbusters ever recover from. 3 weeks before its official release, a crystal clear DVD quality copy suddenly appeared across piracy websites, spreading at astonishing speed. Within days, millions of illegal downloads had transformed opening weekend into an uphill battle before the first legitimate ticket was even sold. For a franchise built on explosive spectacle and event-level anticipation, the biggest audience had already watched the movie from their couches. Yet, as devastating as that leak was, it wasn't the only warning sign. Long before critics weighed in or box office numbers painted the full picture, another announcement had sent longtime fans into disbelief. The series, famous for blood-soaked hard-R mayhem, was returning with a PG-13 rating. The decision felt almost impossible to believe. This was the franchise that existed because modern action films had become too restrained. It promised the return of the unapologetic excess that defined the 1980s and 1990s, bringing together legends who built their careers on exploding bodies, bone-crunching violence, and one-liners delivered through clouds of gunpowder. Suddenly, the very series created as a celebration of that era had chosen to soften its edges in pursuit of younger audiences. Instead of embracing the identity that made it unique, it seemed determined to imitate the blockbuster formula it had originally rebelled against. The contradiction becomes almost surreal when the film itself erupts across the screen. Helicopters rain bullets, armored vehicles smash through concrete barriers, machine guns roar without pause, rockets streak across burning skylines as familiar faces march confidently through walls of fire. Every frame tries to convince viewers they are witnessing the biggest, loudest, most unstoppable gathering of action heroes ever assembled. But beneath every explosion lingers an uncomfortable irony. The mercenaries never truly lose their battles, the film does. What should have been another triumphant celebration of old-school action instead became a case study in how studio strategy can quietly dismantle its own greatest strengths. The piracy leak crippled anticipation, but the sanitized rating sparked an even deeper question about identity. Who was this movie actually trying to satisfy? Loyal fans felt abandoned, while younger audiences already had countless superhero franchises offering polished PG-13 spectacle. In chasing everyone, the film risked belonging to no one. That contradiction is what makes The Expendables 3 so fascinating today. Its greatest enemy wasn't a dictator, a terrorist, or a rival mercenary. It was a collection of corporate decisions that slowly stripped away the very qualities audiences had come to celebrate. More than a disappointing sequel, it became the precise moment when Hollywood discovered that nostalgia alone couldn't sustain an aging formula forever. Sometimes the loudest explosions signal not victory, but the instant an entire era finally runs out of ammunition. That single contradiction opens the door to a much larger story. Because the downfall of The Expendables 3 cannot be explained by one leak, one rating, or even one disappointing weekend. Every decision surrounding the film became another piece of a puzzle that reveals far more than the fate of a single sequel. It reveals an entire genre struggling to understand where it belonged in a rapidly changing Hollywood. This journey begins long before the cameras rolled. We'll trace the production history that reunited legendary action icons while quietly exposing the creative compromises happening behind the scenes. Some of those compromises were financial, others were personal, and a few would become headline news across the entertainment industry. The departure of one franchise veteran, the arrival of another cinematic legend, and the unexpected return of a fan favorite star all reshaped the identity of the team in ways audiences could immediately feel even if they couldn't yet explain why. From there, we'll look beneath the explosions themselves. The Expendables were always designed as symbols of an older generation, fighters who relied on experience, physical toughness, and unwavering loyalty rather than computers and advanced technology. The Expendables 3 deliberately challenges that identity by surrounding them with younger, faster, and more technologically fluent operatives. On paper, it appears to be a natural passing of the torch. In practice, it becomes a fascinating clash between two philosophies of action filmmaking: brute force charisma versus sleek modern efficiency. That conflict exists not only between the characters but within the movie's own creative DNA. We'll also examine the filmmaking choices that shape every emotional beat, from the pacing of its enormous action sequences to the visual language that tries to balance nostalgic grit with contemporary blockbuster polish. Hidden beneath the relentless gunfire are subtle decisions about tone, editing, and spectacle that reveal what the filmmakers believed modern audiences wanted and whether those assumptions were ultimately correct. Along the way, several defining moments deserve a closer look. We'll unpack why the controversial PG-13 rating became one of the franchise's most debated decisions, how Harrison Ford's arrival following Bruce Willis' highly publicized exit changed the chemistry of the ensemble, and why Wesley Snipes' long-awaited return to the big screen remains one of the film's most memorable bright spots. Standing over all of it is Mel Gibson, whose magnetic performance transforms a conventional villain into one of the sequel's greatest strengths, often threatening to outshine the heroes themselves. This is not simply a review of what works and what doesn't. It's an examination of a franchise standing at the crossroads between two generations, a changing industry redefining blockbuster entertainment, and the moment when one of cinema's most beloved action formulas discovered that surviving the battlefield was easier than surviving the evolution of Hollywood itself. For an entire generation, action movies weren't just entertainment, they were arguments waiting to happen. School playgrounds, living rooms, video rental stores, and late night television all inspired the same impossible question: who would actually win? Would Sylvester Stallone overpower Arnold Schwarzenegger? Could Bruce Willis outsmart everyone else? Was Mel Gibson too unpredictable to beat? Later, new names joined those imaginary tournaments, but the fantasy never really changed. Every fan had a favorite, and every favorite felt larger than life. That is exactly why The Expendables felt so special when it was first announced. Instead of asking audiences to choose between their childhood heroes, it promised something Hollywood had never truly delivered before. The biggest action legends from different franchises, different studios, and different eras would finally occupy the same world. It was the cinematic equivalent of watching decades of movie posters suddenly come alive together. Characters didn't matter nearly as much as the faces behind them. Audiences weren't buying tickets to meet new heroes, they were reconnecting with old friends. Upanin sinminingonas sinoutsonans kudero muanond Vitamin sin pegomyoninsin. For older Gen Z viewers, they became legends discovered through television reruns, DVDs borrowed from parents, and internet clips celebrating the greatest action scenes ever filmed. Even if someone hadn't grown up during the golden age of 1980s action cinema, its influence had already become part of popular culture. These weren't simply movie stars, they were the blueprint for what an action hero looked, sounded, and behaved like. There is also something deeply human about watching icons refuse to disappear. Age changes everyone, even the seemingly invincible figures who once carried entire blockbusters on their shoulders. Yet seeing Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Harrison Ford, Wesley Snipes, and their contemporaries still marching toward danger with unwavering confidence taps into a quiet emotional hope that time can be challenged, if only for 2 hours. The wrinkles, slower movements, and weathered faces don't diminish the fantasy. In many ways, they strengthen it. Every scar becomes proof of survival rather than decline. But that emotional connection also carries an unspoken sadness. The Expendables 3 arrived at the exact moment when audiences could sense that this extraordinary gathering might never happen again. The era that produced singular action superstars was fading, replaced by interconnected franchises, shared universes, and heroes defined more by intellectual property than individual charisma. The film wasn't simply another sequel. It felt like one final reunion before the lights went out on an entire generation of blockbuster filmmaking. That is what makes revisiting it today so compelling. Beyond the explosions and familiar one-liners lies a snapshot of cinema at the edge of transformation, a moment when legendary names still stood together in the same frame, even as the industry quietly moved on without them. The success of The Expendables 2 left the franchise in an unusual position. It had achieved exactly what many people once believed was impossible, bringing together an astonishing collection of action legends and proving there was still a massive audience eager to watch them share the screen. Financially, the formula had worked. Nostalgia had become profitable. Critics were generally warmer than they had been toward the first film, and fans embraced the simple joy of seeing decades of action history collide in one explosive universe. Naturally, the next question wasn't whether another sequel would happen, it was how the series could possibly become even bigger.
For Sylvester Stallone, repeating the previous film wasn't enough. The third installment needed to expand the franchise beyond the novelty of famous faces standing together. His ambition was to make the series feel larger in every direction. Bigger action sequences. A broader international appeal. Younger recruits standing beside veteran warriors. Instead of treating the Expendables as a fixed team, the idea was to transform them into an evolving organization capable of surviving beyond a single generation. On paper, it was a logical evolution. If these characters were professional mercenaries, eventually they would need successors. The challenge was ensuring that expansion didn't dilute the identity audiences had fallen in love with. That philosophy extended behind the camera as well. Rather than directing once again, Stallone handed the reins to Australian filmmaker Patrick Hughes. At the time, Hughes wasn't a household name, but his gritty thriller Red Hill had attracted attention for its confident direction, tense atmosphere, and ability to deliver impressive scale despite modest resources. Choosing him reflected an interesting creative gamble. Instead of hiring an established blockbuster specialist, the production looked toward an emerging filmmaker whose visual instincts suggested he could balance old-fashioned practical action with modern pacing. Hughes inherited an enormous responsibility. He wasn't simply directing another action movie. He was orchestrating one of the largest ensembles of legendary performers ever assembled. As pre-production accelerated, the roster itself became almost as important as the screenplay. Every casting announcement generated headlines because each new addition represented another chapter of action cinema entering the same universe. Fans followed every rumor, wondering which icon might appear next. That excitement, however, quickly collided with one of the franchise's most public controversies. Bruce Willis, who had appeared in the previous films as the mysterious Church, was expected to return. Instead, negotiations reportedly collapsed over salary disagreements for a brief period of shooting. The dispute exploded into public view when Stallone posted a blunt message on social media describing Willis as greedy and lazy, words that instantly dominated entertainment headlines. It was a remarkably public fracture between two Hollywood veterans whose careers had defined different eras of action filmmaking. Whether audiences sided with Stallone or Willis almost became secondary. The incident exposed that assembling cinematic legends wasn't merely a creative challenge. It also involved navigating enormous personalities, expectations, and business realities behind closed doors. Fortunately for the production, one departure created an opportunity for another arrival. Harrison Ford joined the cast as Max Drummer, replacing Willis's role within the franchise. It was an inspired piece of casting because Ford represented a different branch of action mythology. While Stallone, Schwarzenegger, and Willis were synonymous with explosive modern action, Ford carried the legacy of adventure heroes whose intelligence often mattered as much as brute force. His presence instantly elevated the ensemble, reminding audiences that the definition of an action icon had never been limited to muscles alone. Another headline-making addition carried an entirely different kind of significance. Wesley Snipes returned to the big screen after serving time in federal prison for tax-related convictions. His first major role following his release added an undeniable layer of real-world narrative to the film. The screenplay cleverly acknowledged his absence with self-aware humor, allowing audiences to laugh with the actor instead of pretending the years had never happened. More importantly, Snipes still possessed the effortless athleticism and screen presence that had made him one of the defining stars of 1990s action cinema. His comeback injected genuine excitement into the project, making his casting feel like more than simple nostalgia. Then came Antonio Banderas, whose arrival shifted the team's energy in an entirely different direction. Rather than trying to outdo everyone with stoic toughness, Banderas embraced relentless enthusiasm, rapid-fire dialogue, and infectious charisma. His character provided a welcome contrast to the hardened veterans surrounding him, adding humor without reducing the stakes. In a franchise filled with gravel-voiced warriors who often communicated through silence and gunfire, Banderas brought an almost overwhelming eagerness that made him immediately memorable. By the time production was underway, The Expendables 3 had assembled one of the most extraordinary casts the genre had ever seen. Yet beneath the excitement, the creative philosophy driving the sequel had already begun reshaping the franchise itself. New blood was arriving. Familiar faces were disappearing. Different generations of action cinema were being asked to coexist within the same battlefield. The lineup looked bigger than ever, but hidden inside that expansion was a question that would ultimately define the entire film. Could a franchise built as a celebration of old-school action reinvent itself without sacrificing the very identity that made audiences care in the first place? By the summer of 2014, The Expendables 3 wasn't entering the same Hollywood that had welcomed the original film just 4 years earlier. The blockbuster landscape had evolved at remarkable speed. Audiences were no longer drawn solely by the promise of recognizable stars carrying a movie on their shoulders. Increasingly, the biggest attraction was the franchise itself. Shared universes, recognizable brands, and spectacular visual effects had become the dominant language of modern entertainment. That shift created an unusual challenge for a series built almost entirely around the charisma of individual action legends. Lionsgate understood that reality from the very beginning of its marketing campaign. Selling another reunion of 1980s icons might satisfy loyal fans, but the studio also wanted to reach viewers who had grown up in a completely different cinematic era. Rather than presenting the sequel as a farewell tour for aging heroes, the campaign emphasized evolution. This wasn't supposed to feel like a museum of action history. It was marketed as a meeting point between generations, where established legends would pass alongside younger recruits ready to inherit the battlefield. Nothing demonstrated that ambition more dramatically than the film's unforgettable appearance at the Cannes Film Festival. Instead of relying on a conventional press conference or red carpet premiere, the production embraced the oversized personality that had always defined the franchise. Members of the cast arrived riding actual military tanks along the Boulevard de la Croisette, transforming one of cinema's most prestigious festivals into an action spectacle worthy of the films themselves. Cameras captured Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jason Statham, Harrison Ford, Antonio Banderas, Mel Gibson, Wesley Snipes, Dolph Lundgren, Terry Crews, Randy Couture, Kelsey Grammer, and the rest of the ensemble celebrating together in an image that felt almost surreal. It was less a promotional event than a living monument to decades of blockbuster history, reminding the world that no other franchise could gather this many legendary action stars in one place. For longtime fans, those images were thrilling. Seeing so many familiar faces together generated genuine excitement because it fulfilled fantasies that had existed for decades. Yet the spectacle also hinted at the franchise's central dilemma. The campaign focused heavily on the stars themselves, assuming their collective presence remained the ultimate selling point. Hollywood, however, was changing faster than anyone expected. To broaden the film's appeal, Lionsgate and the filmmakers introduced an entirely new generation of operatives. The additions weren't random. Each newcomer represented a different audience the studio hoped to attract. Ronda Rousey arrived carrying enormous momentum as one of the fastest rising combat sports stars in the world, bringing real-world credibility and a growing mainstream profile. Kellen Lutz represented younger action audiences familiar with contemporary franchise filmmaking, while Victor Ortiz added another recognizable athlete whose physical authenticity aligned naturally with the series' emphasis on elite fighters. Glenn Powell, still years away from becoming one of Hollywood's leading men, entered the ensemble as part of this fresh wave of talent designed to signal that the Expendables weren't simply looking backward, they were preparing for the future. From a business perspective, the strategy made perfect sense. Stallone's veteran mercenaries could continue attracting established fans, while younger performers offered potential entry points for audiences with fewer emotional connections to the action heroes of previous decades. The problem was that this balancing act required satisfying two very different expectations simultaneously. Existing fans primarily wanted more time with the icons they already loved. New audiences, meanwhile, had little nostalgic investment in those legends and were already being courted by an entirely different generation of blockbuster entertainment. That changing taste became increasingly obvious across the summer box office. Guardians of the Galaxy surprised the industry by transforming a relatively obscure comic book property into a cultural phenomenon through humor, cosmic adventure, vibrant visual effects, and an ensemble that felt unmistakably modern. Around the same period, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles demonstrated that recognizable brands powered by CGI spectacle could still attract massive crowds. Both films reflected where mainstream blockbuster cinema was heading. Audiences increasingly embraced larger fictional universes, stylized visual worlds, and interconnected franchises rather than movies built primarily around individual movie stars. This wasn't simply competition at the box office. It represented a deeper transformation in audience expectations. During the 1980s and 1990s, a single actor's name above the title could often guarantee commercial success. Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Willis, Gibson, and Ford had each experienced that extraordinary level of star power during their careers. By 2014, however, studios were investing more heavily in intellectual property than personalities. Characters could be recast. Universes could continue indefinitely. Brands had become more dependable than individual celebrities. Ironically, The Expendables had originally succeeded because it celebrated precisely the kind of star-driven filmmaking that modern Hollywood seemed to be leaving behind. The first two films functioned almost like victory laps for performers whose identities were inseparable from the action genre itself. The third installment attempted to modernize that formula without abandoning it entirely, creating a hybrid approach that reflected the uncertainty of the era. Was this still a celebration of legendary action icons, or was it quietly transforming into something designed to resemble contemporary franchise filmmaking? Every trailer, interview, and promotional event tried to answer that question by insisting audiences could enjoy both worlds at once. Massive practical explosions stood beside younger, faster recruits. Veteran heroes shared the spotlight with rising stars. Nostalgia mixed with promises of renewal. On paper, it sounded like the perfect compromise. Yet compromise is often difficult to market because it lacks the clarity of a single identity. As opening weekend approached, anticipation remained high, the cast looked unmatched, and the promotional campaign had delivered unforgettable images across the world. But beneath the tanks, celebrity appearances, and explosive trailers, a subtle tension continued to grow. The Expendables 3 wasn't merely competing against other movies. It was competing against an industry that had fundamentally changed the rules of what audiences expected from blockbuster action, placing extraordinary pressure on one of the last great star-powered franchises to prove it still belonged in Hollywood's rapidly evolving future. Rather than easing audiences back into its world, The Expendables 3 opens at full throttle. There is no slow introduction, no lengthy exposition, and no attempt to quietly reassemble the team. Instead, the film throws viewers directly into a rescue mission unfolding aboard a heavily guarded armored train, immediately reminding us that these mercenaries don't solve problems through diplomacy. They overwhelm them with precision, confidence, and overwhelming firepower. It's an opening designed to reassure longtime fans that, despite everything surrounding the production, the franchise still understands how to stage a spectacular action sequence. The target is Drummer's latest assignment for Barney Ross and his crew, rescue Dr. Doc Death, an original expendable imprisoned inside a moving military convoy. Even before Wesley Snipes fully steps into the spotlight, the mission establishes the familiar rhythm of the team's operations. Every member understands their role instinctively. Barney remains the calm strategist who leads from the front rather than the rear. Lee Christmas continues to function as his most trusted partner, balancing lethal efficiency with unwavering loyalty. Gunnar Jensen contributes his unpredictable confidence, while Toll Road brings quiet professionalism that rarely demands attention but consistently keeps the operation moving. Years of shared experience have transformed these individuals into something resembling a family. Their conversations are brief because they no longer need lengthy explanations. Trust has replaced discussion. Visually, the sequence embraces classic action filmmaking. The armored train becomes a moving battlefield where momentum itself increases the tension. Vehicles race alongside speeding railcars, explosions tear apart steel barriers, and bullets ricochet through confined spaces that leave almost no room for error. Instead of relying exclusively on digital spectacle, the scene emphasizes physical movement and practical chaos. Every collision carries weight. Every leap between vehicles feels dangerous because the environment constantly threatens to punish even the smallest mistake. Patrick Hughes immediately establishes a pace that rarely allows viewers to breathe, making the rescue feel less like a carefully rehearsed operation and more like controlled madness held together by veteran instincts. Then Wesley Snipes finally arrives, and the entire atmosphere shifts. After years away from major Hollywood productions, Snipes walks back onto the screen with remarkable confidence, immediately reminding audiences why he became one of the defining action stars of the 1990s. His first moments don't rely on elaborate speeches or emotional reunions. Instead, they lean into self-awareness. When Doc casually jokes that he was imprisoned for tax evasion, the line lands because everyone watching understands the real-world history behind it. Rather than ignoring the actor's absence, the screenplay transforms it into comedy, inviting audiences to laugh with Snipes instead of pretending nothing happened. It's one of the film's smartest pieces of meta-humor because it feels effortless rather than forced. The joke also serves another purpose. It instantly communicates Doc's personality. He refuses to dwell on the past or present himself as a tragic figure. Like the rest of the Expendables, he survives by treating danger and hardship with almost reckless confidence. Humor becomes another weapon, allowing him to walk back into the group without disrupting its established chemistry. That chemistry is crucial because the opening doesn't merely introduce returning characters. It reminds viewers why this team worked in the first place. Barney still commands respect without demanding it. Christmas remains fiercely dependable, capable of anticipating Barney's decisions almost before they're spoken. Gunnar continues walking the line between brilliance and instability, supplying moments of unpredictability that prevent the group from becoming overly disciplined. Toll Road anchors the ensemble through consistency rather than flashy heroics. Together, they represent different personalities united by experience rather than ideology. They are professionals first, friends second, and both identities strengthen the other. Once Doc rejoins the team, the film wastes little time celebrating the reunion. Another assignment arrives almost immediately, carrying the crew towards Somalia to intercept an illegal weapons shipment before it reaches dangerous buyers. Structurally, this transition keeps the narrative moving at an aggressive pace. Instead of lingering on nostalgia, the movie insists that mercenary life never pauses for sentimental reflection. One mission simply leads to the next. The Somali operation initially appears straightforward. The Expendables infiltrate a heavily defended port where weapons are being exchanged under layers of armed security. The location itself reinforces the franchise's global ambitions. Cargo containers form narrow corridors that can become deadly ambush points. Cranes tower over the battlefield like giant mechanical sentinels. Rusted industrial machinery contrasts with cutting-edge military hardware, creating an environment that feels simultaneously realistic and cinematic. As always, the team enters with calculated confidence, using surprise and coordinated aggression to overwhelm opponents before resistance can properly organize. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, subtle unease begins creeping into the story. The mission feels almost too routine for veterans of this caliber. The audience senses that something unexpected is waiting beyond the next container or around the next corner. Patrick Hughes carefully stretches that anticipation by allowing brief moments of uncertainty to interrupt the otherwise relentless momentum. Instead of focusing exclusively on explosions, the sequence gradually shifts toward mystery. Then comes the revelation that completely changes the film's direction. Standing among the weapons dealers is Conrad Stonebanks, played with commanding presence by Mel Gibson. His appearance lands with genuine shock because Stonebanks isn't supposed to be alive. More importantly, he isn't merely another criminal target. He is one of the original founders of the Expendables, a man who helped create the very organization Barney now leads before choosing a darker path that supposedly ended with his death years earlier. That single moment instantly transforms an ordinary assignment into something deeply personal. The enemy is no longer an anonymous warlord or international arms dealer. He is a ghost from Barney's own history, carrying memories, betrayals, and unanswered questions that no amount of gunfire can erase. In just a few minutes, the film shifts from explosive spectacle into a conflict driven by shared history, proving that the most dangerous opponent isn't always the one with the biggest army. Sometimes it's the man who already knows exactly how you think, how you fight, and why you became who you are. Stonebanks' reappearance doesn't simply alter the mission. It shatters Barney Ross's confidence in a way no previous enemy has managed. Until this point, every operation has reinforced the belief that experience is the Expendables' greatest weapon. They may be older, slower, and carrying the scars of countless battles, but their instincts always compensate for whatever time has taken away. Stonebanks exposes the flaw in that belief almost immediately. He doesn't fight like a nostalgic relic from the past. He operates with ruthless efficiency, modern resources, and a complete understanding of how Barney and his team think. That combination makes him uniquely dangerous. The confrontation escalates with shocking speed. As the firefight erupts across the Somali port, bullets tear through the industrial maze while both sides fight for control of the weapons shipment. The Expendables respond with the confidence audiences expect, pushing forward despite overwhelming resistance. Yet the momentum abruptly collapses when Hail Caesar is struck by devastating gunfire. Terry Crew's imposing presence has always made Caesar feel nearly indestructible, a towering force whose heavy weapons often shift the balance of every battle. Watching him suddenly fall creates genuine emotional shock because the franchise has rarely allowed its core members to appear this vulnerable. The sequence deliberately avoids turning Caesar's injury into simple spectacle. Instead, Hughes slows the emotional rhythm just enough for the audience to absorb Barney's reaction. His focus immediately shifts away from defeating Stonebanks and towards saving his friend. In that instant, the mission no longer matters. Loyalty does. Stallone plays the moment with restrained desperation rather than dramatic outbursts. Barney has spent years accepting violence as an unavoidable part of his profession, but this wound feels different because it isn't merely the consequence of dangerous work. It feels personal. Stonebanks hasn't just attacked the team. He's attacked Barney's past, his judgment, and the family he built after abandoning his former partner. Caesar's condition becomes the emotional catalyst that drives the entire story forward. Even after reaching medical care, his survival remains uncertain, leaving Barney trapped between relief and overwhelming guilt. Leaders in action films are often portrayed as men who confidently shoulder responsibility without hesitation. Barney's psychology is more complicated. Every injury suffered by his team becomes another failure he quietly carries alone. He doesn't express that burden through speeches. He internalizes it, convincing himself that every decision rests entirely on his shoulders. Stonebanks understands that weakness better than anyone because he once stood beside Barney, sharing the same philosophy before choosing a different path. That emotional weight follows Barney into one of the film's most understated scenes. Inside the bar, surrounded by familiar faces and familiar silence, he reaches a conclusion that feels almost impossible for him to speak aloud. Rather than risk losing another friend, he decides the Expendables must end as they currently exist. The conversation with Lee Christmas carries remarkable emotional restraint. There are no lengthy arguments or sentimental declarations. Jason Statham's performance relies almost entirely on subtle disappointment. Christmas doesn't need Barney to explain every detail because years of partnership allow him to recognize the decision immediately. The pain comes not from misunderstanding, but from knowing Barney is pushing everyone away out of love disguised as cold logic. Psychologically, Barney believes sacrifice is leadership. If distancing himself protects the people he cares about, then isolation becomes another burden he willingly accepts. It's an understandable impulse, yet also a tragic flaw. Instead of trusting his team to face danger together, he assumes every risk belongs solely to him. That mindset has defined his career, but Stonebanks has forced it into dangerous territory. Barney begins treating friendship as a liability rather than a strength, believing that caring for others only gives enemies more opportunities to hurt him. The film reinforces this turning point through the arrival of Max Drummer. Following the earlier casting change that brought Harrison Ford into the franchise, Drummer quickly establishes a different energy from the mysterious authority figures seen in previous installments. Ford plays him with understated confidence, allowing calm authority to replace unnecessary theatrics. When Barney receives instructions to capture Stonebanks alive and deliver him to the International Criminal Court, the objective immediately becomes more complicated than simple revenge. Killing the enemy would be easier. Bringing him to justice requires discipline, restraint, and careful planning. This mandate also reflects an interesting thematic shift. Earlier Expendables films often embraced direct solutions where overwhelming force ended every conflict. Here, international accountability enters the narrative, suggesting that even legendary mercenaries must operate within changing geopolitical realities. Stonebanks isn't merely another target to eliminate. He represents crime significant enough to demand public judgment, transforming the mission into something larger than personal vengeance. Still convinced that his veteran teammates are now vulnerable, Barney searches for a different solution. If Stonebanks has evolved alongside modern warfare, perhaps defeating him requires fighters shaped by that same world. This idea becomes the foundation for the film's generational divide. Rather than relying exclusively on battle-hardened veterans, Barney seeks younger mercenaries whose speed, technical skills, and contemporary training might counter an enemy who has already adapted beyond traditional combat. That search introduces Bonaparte, portrayed with effortless warmth by Kelsey Grammer. Unlike the hardened soldiers surrounding him, Bonaparte operates as a recruiter with an eye for talent rather than destruction. His scenes inject welcome humanity into the narrative, emphasizing personalities instead of firepower. Through him, the recruitment process resembles assembling an elite sports team as much as preparing for war. Each candidate brings a different specialty, suggesting that modern combat increasingly rewards diverse skill sets over brute strength alone. The resulting montage unfolds with infectious momentum. John Smiley projects fearless confidence balanced by youthful recklessness. Luna combines athletic precision with determination, representing a generation that refuses to accept limitations traditionally placed upon women in action cinema. Thorne contributes advanced technical expertise, illustrating how intelligence and digital fluency have become just as valuable as physical power on contemporary battlefields. Mars rounds out the group with disciplined professionalism, completing a team designed to complement rather than imitate Barney's original crew. Threading through these introductions is Galgo, Antonio Banderas' endlessly enthusiastic mercenary whose relentless optimism threatens to exhaust everyone around him. His constant storytelling and boundless excitement provide immediate comic relief, but beneath the humor lies genuine emotional purpose. Galgo desperately wants another chance to prove himself, making his endless energy less irritating than deeply human. He reminds audiences that every legendary veteran was once an eager newcomer hoping someone would finally say yes. By the end of this journey, Barney has assembled an entirely different kind of Expendables team. On the surface, it appears to be a practical response to an evolving enemy. Beneath that decision, however, lies a far more personal conflict. Barney isn't simply recruiting younger mercenaries. He's trying to outrun the painful realization that even legends cannot protect the people they love forever, no matter how many battles they've already survived. With his veteran teammates left behind, Barney Ross steps into unfamiliar territory carrying an equally unfamiliar team. On the surface, the new recruits possess everything he believes is necessary to confront Conrad Stonebanks. They are faster, younger, and more comfortable with the technology shaping modern combat. Their confidence comes not only from physical ability but from an instinctive understanding of surveillance systems, encrypted communications, digital intelligence, and precision tactics. Barney has assembled them to solve a problem that brute force alone can no longer overcome. Yet from the very beginning, there is an unmistakable tension beneath every interaction. These mercenaries may share the same objective, but they do not yet share the trust that defined the original Expendables. Their first major operation takes them to Romania, where intelligence points towards Stonebanks conducting a high-value art transaction. The choice of location immediately changes the visual language of the film. Instead of abandoned warehouses or chaotic war zones, the mission unfolds across sleek urban environments, modern architecture, and carefully controlled security networks. The contrast reinforces the evolving nature of global crime. Stonebanks no longer hides in isolated jungles. He operates within sophisticated international systems, blending wealth, influence, and military precision into a single criminal enterprise. The planning phase reflects that evolution. Rather than charging directly toward the target with overwhelming firepower, Barney allows the younger operatives to shape the mission through contemporary methods of reconnaissance. Small drones quietly survey the surrounding streets, transmitting real-time intelligence that replaces guesswork with calculated precision. Electronic surveillance identifies movement before enemies become visible. Secure communications coordinate every position with remarkable efficiency, while digital mapping transforms the city into a constantly updating tactical blueprint. These aren't simply flashy gadgets inserted to appear modern. They symbolize a fundamental shift in how warfare itself has changed. Information now travels faster than bullets, and whoever controls that information often controls the battlefield. Even Barney appears slightly outside his comfort zone. He respects the effectiveness of these systems, but Stallone subtly conveys that his instincts remain rooted in experience rather than technology. He watches, listens, and adapts, trusting younger specialists to manage tools that never existed during his earliest missions. The film quietly suggests that genuine leadership is not about knowing everything. It is about recognizing when others possess expertise you lack. As the operation begins, the younger squad demonstrates impressive coordination. Electronic interference blinds hostile communications, allowing the team to move through security layers with surprising efficiency. Night vision equipment transforms darkness into an advantage instead of an obstacle, while carefully timed hand-to-hand engagements eliminate guards without attracting unnecessary attention. The choreography feels noticeably different from the earlier Somali firefight. Precision replaces spectacle. Silence becomes just as valuable as explosions. It is a deliberate stylistic contrast, presenting modern tactical operations as controlled and methodical rather than overwhelmingly destructive. For a brief moment, Barney's gamble appears completely justified. Stonebanks is successfully intercepted and forced into a luxury transport vehicle before his organization can fully respond. The mission unfolds almost exactly as planned, creating the impression that this younger generation has accomplished what Barney's veteran crew might have struggled to achieve through traditional methods alone. Yet that apparent victory lasts only long enough to expose a deeper misunderstanding of the man sitting in custody. Inside the moving vehicle, the film unexpectedly slows its pace. Instead of rushing toward another action sequence, it allows Barney and Stonebanks to confront one another through conversation. These scenes reveal why Mel Gibson's performance elevates the entire film. Stonebanks never behaves like a cornered criminal desperately searching for escape. He remains composed, almost amused, treating captivity as another opportunity to manipulate the people around him. Violence has always been his profession, but psychology is equally important to his arsenal. The dialogue between the former partners becomes less an interrogation than a philosophical duel. Stonebanks challenges Barney's belief that replacing his old team with younger recruits somehow protects the people he loves. He recognizes Barney's motivations almost instantly because they once shared the same worldview. Their greatest difference is not experience or skill but morality. Barney continues sacrificing himself for others, while Stonebanks abandoned that principle long ago, embracing survival without conscience. Gibson delivers these observations with unsettling calm, forcing Barney to confront uncomfortable truths rather than obvious insults. This exchange also dismantles Barney's confidence in his own strategy. Stonebanks senses that the younger team lacks the emotional bond that once made the Expendables nearly unstoppable. They function efficiently, but efficiency alone cannot replace years of shared hardship. The original crew trusted one another instinctively because they had repeatedly faced impossible situations together. Barney's recruits, despite their talent, remain professionals connected primarily through assignment rather than loyalty. Stonebanks understands that weakness long before Barney does. Then the illusion of success collapses. Hidden within the transport is a GPS tracker that Stonebanks deliberately allows his captors to overlook. The device silently transmits their location to his organization, transforming the convoy from hunter into prey. It is a perfect reflection of Stonebanks' philosophy. Every setback has already been anticipated. Every apparent defeat conceals another layer of planning. Instead of escaping through brute force, he simply waits for Barney's confidence to create the ideal moment for retaliation. The resulting counterattack erupts with devastating speed. Missiles strike the convoy before anyone fully comprehends the trap unfolding around them. The carefully organized tactical operation disintegrates into chaos as explosions consume vehicles and tear apart the surrounding landscape. Advanced technology, which moments earlier seemed to guarantee victory, suddenly becomes meaningless against an enemy who has anticipated every move. Hughes deliberately reverses the earlier contrast between precision and disorder, reminding viewers that even flawless execution cannot overcome fundamentally flawed assumptions. Stonebank's forces seize the opportunity with ruthless efficiency. Barney's younger recruits are overwhelmed and captured before they can reorganize, their technical advantages erased by an opponent who has manipulated the battlefield from the very beginning. The sequence exposes the danger of confusing innovation with invincibility. Drones, encrypted communications, and digital surveillance remain valuable tools, but they cannot compensate for an enemy who understands human psychology better than any computer algorithm. Barney suffers the most brutal consequence. Thrown from a collapsing bridge by the force of the attack, he plunges into the river below, disappearing beneath the violent current as wreckage crashes around him. The image carries symbolic weight beyond its immediate danger. Barney has spent the entire story attempting to cross from one generation of mercenaries to another, convinced he could leave the past behind through careful planning and modern tactics. Instead, he finds himself literally cast into the depths by the consequences of that decision, while the young team he hoped to protect disappears into Stonebank's hands. In a single devastating ambush, the mission fails, the strategy collapses, and Barney is left with the painful realization that he has lost far more than a battle. He has proven his greatest enemy right: the river does more than break Barney Ross's fall. It strips away every certainty he has been clinging to since Stonebank's resurfaced. When he finally drags himself onto the riverbank, bruised, exhausted, and alone, the image feels strikingly different from the confident commander who assembled a new generation only hours earlier. His carefully planned strategy has collapsed in spectacular fashion. The younger squad he believed would be safer without the veterans is now in enemy hands, and the decision meant to protect everyone has achieved the exact opposite. For perhaps the first time in the franchise, Barney isn't defeated because he lacks strength. He's defeated because his judgment has failed. That distinction matters. Physical wounds heal, but leadership carries invisible injuries that linger much longer. Barney has always accepted responsibility for dangerous missions, yet this situation cuts deeper because the people captured were recruited through his own choice. He convinced them to trust his experience, led them into a carefully planned operation, and watched that plan unravel under the weight of Stonebank's superior foresight. The burden of that failure settles heavily across Stallone's restrained performance. He speaks little because guilt rarely requires words. Every quiet pause communicates the same painful conclusion: this is his fault. Psychologically, Barney falls into a familiar pattern. Instead of asking for help, he begins convincing himself that isolation is the only honorable response. Throughout the series, he has repeatedly measured leadership through personal sacrifice. If someone must pay the price, it should always be him. Stonebanks understands this instinct better than anyone because it is the same code they once shared before taking radically different paths. The villain has spent the entire film manipulating Barney's sense of responsibility, patiently steering him toward a moment where guilt becomes more powerful than fear. Stonebanks wastes no time exploiting that vulnerability. Before long, a recorded transmission reaches Barney, replacing uncertainty with terrifying clarity. The younger recruits are alive but imprisoned inside a deserted military installation in Uzbekistan, surrounded by armed mercenaries and enough explosives to eliminate anyone reckless enough to attempt a rescue. Rather than hiding his location, Stonebanks openly reveals it. The message isn't merely an update. It is a calculated invitation. Mel Gibson delivers the broadcast with unnerving composure. Stonebanks doesn't scream threats or indulge in theatrical cruelty. Instead, he speaks with the confidence of someone who has already anticipated every possible response. He knows Barney will come because loyalty defines him more completely than logic ever could. The challenge, therefore, isn't convincing Barney to attack. It's controlling exactly how and when that attack unfolds. By broadcasting the trap instead of concealing it, Stonebanks transforms rescue into psychological warfare. Every second Barney spends watching the transmission deepens the emotional pressure while reinforcing the illusion that he still has a choice. The abandoned military complex itself becomes a visual extension of Stonebanks' philosophy. Cold concrete corridors, rusting industrial structures, and forgotten machinery create an environment that feels suspended between past and present. Once built for organized warfare, the facility has become a monument to conflict stripped of ideology, now serving only whoever possesses enough money and firepower to occupy it. It mirrors Stonebanks himself, a soldier whose original purpose has long since eroded into something colder and more transactional. Faced with impossible odds, Barney reaches the conclusion audiences expect from him. He decides to go alone. From his perspective, the decision appears almost logical. Every previous attempt to protect others has ended in disaster, so eliminating everyone else from the equation seems like the only remaining option. If he dies confronting Stonebanks, at least no additional friends will suffer because of his choices. It is an act of courage rooted in self-condemnation rather than confidence. Barney no longer believes he deserves another chance to lead. He simply believes he owes one final debt. Yet this is precisely where the film begins dismantling Barney's flawed understanding of leadership. As preparations quietly begin, familiar figures gradually reappear. Lee Christmas arrives first, carrying the same unwavering loyalty that has always defined his relationship with Barney. There is no dramatic speech announcing forgiveness because none is necessary. Christmas never stopped believing they belonged together. Gunnar follows with his unpredictable blend of humor and determination, proving that even beneath his eccentric personality lies absolute commitment to the people he considers family. Toll Road joins them with characteristic calm, his dependable presence reinforcing the quiet strength that has often held the team together without demanding recognition. Doc returns as well, refusing to allow the man who rescued him only days earlier to face certain death alone. His inclusion carries additional emotional weight because Barney's first mission in the film was dedicated to bringing him back into the fold. That bond now comes full circle. Alongside them stands Galgo, whose relentless enthusiasm suddenly acquires deeper significance. Earlier, his eagerness often seemed almost excessive, but now it reveals itself as genuine courage. He isn't chasing excitement anymore. He's choosing loyalty. Nobody forces him to participate, yet he refuses to remain behind simply because the odds are impossible. The reunion unfolds with remarkable restraint. No one delivers inspirational monologues. No one debates complicated tactics. The veterans simply reject Barney's attempt to carry the burden alone. Their response reflects years of shared experience rather than emotional persuasion. They have already survived countless impossible situations together, and they refuse to let pride destroy the one principle that has always kept them alive: no expendable fights alone. This moment quietly transforms the film's central theme. Earlier, Barney viewed age as a weakness requiring replacement. The younger recruits represented the future, while the veterans represented a vulnerable past he felt responsible for protecting. That rigid separation now collapses completely. The problem was never old versus young. It was Barney's belief that either generation could succeed without the other. The returning team embodies something far more meaningful than nostalgia. Their value isn't measured by physical speed or technological expertise. It lies in trust forged through years of sacrifice, failures, victories, and mutual respect. They understand one another instinctively because every scar carries shared history. At the same time, rescuing the younger mercenaries is no longer about proving the superiority of the old guard. It is about preserving the future alongside the past. By refusing Barney's orders, the veterans accomplish something Stonebanks never anticipated. They remind their leader that true strength has never come from standing alone at the front of the battlefield. It has always come from the people willing to stand beside him when every logical reason says they should walk away. As the reunited team prepares for one final assault, the mission becomes larger than revenge or redemption. It becomes the first moment in the story where different generations stop competing for relevance and finally begin fighting for the same cause. The assault on Stonebank's fortress abandoned subtlety from the very first shot. Every lesson, every failure, and every emotional divide that has shaped the story now converges inside a sprawling abandoned military complex transformed into a battlefield. Yet unlike the earlier missions, this operation is no longer built around one generation proving itself superior to another. The veterans return with decades of experience. The younger operatives contribute speed, technical expertise, and adaptability. For the first time in the film, everyone fights as a single unit rather than separate philosophies forced into the same mission. That unity immediately changes the energy of the action. The opening breach erupts with overwhelming force. Heavy machine guns hammer defensive positions while explosions tear through reinforced walls, creating multiple entry points for the rescue team. The veterans naturally gravitate toward direct confrontation, pushing relentlessly through enemy lines with the confidence earned from countless campaigns. At the same time, the younger recruits coordinate flanking maneuvers, monitor surveillance systems, and relay tactical information that keeps the assault organized despite the surrounding chaos. Hughes carefully stages these parallel approaches so neither overshadows the other. Instead, each generation compensates for the weaknesses of the other, visually reinforcing the film's evolving message. Soon the battlefield expands in every direction. Close-quarters firefights unfold alongside martial arts exchanges as Yin Yang returns with the speed and precision that made him one of the franchise's most distinctive fighters. Rather than relying on brute force, he slices efficiently through opponents whose heavier weapons become useless once distance disappears. Nearby, Trench enters the conflict with his unmistakable confidence, adding another legendary presence to a team already overflowing with cinematic history. Watching these familiar faces reunite carries emotional satisfaction because their appearances feel earned rather than obligatory. They aren't simply nostalgic cameos. They represent old allies answering one final call. The scale continues escalating. Armored vehicles crash through fortified barriers while mounted weapons unleash relentless streams of fire across the compound. The abandoned military installation, already scarred by decades of conflict, gradually collapses beneath the combined weight of artillery, collapsing structures, and continuous explosions. Above the battlefield, Max Drummer arrives in an attack helicopter, transforming the assault into a fully coordinated offensive. Harrison Ford's calm authority contrasts sharply with the destruction below, reminding viewers that experienced leadership often depends less on dramatic speeches than decisive action delivered at precisely the right moment. Air support prevents Stonebank's forces from regrouping, forcing them into increasingly desperate defensive positions. Amid this spectacular chaos, the younger team finally demonstrates why Barney recruited them in the first place. While the veterans hold back wave after wave of mercenaries, Thorne focuses on a different enemy altogether. Stonebanks has rigged the compound with enough C4 explosives to destroy everyone inside once the countdown reaches 0. Defusing that threat requires technical expertise rather than firepower. Under relentless pressure, with gunfire echoing through the facility and enemies closing from every direction, Thorne races against time to penetrate the security systems controlling the explosives. The sequence cleverly balances digital problem-solving with physical danger. Every second spent hacking places the team at greater risk, forcing the veterans to create space through increasingly desperate firefights. Technology alone cannot save the mission. Neither can brute force. Success depends on both working together simultaneously. This cooperation represents the emotional payoff the film has been building toward. Earlier, Barney believed modern skills could replace old experience. Later, he rediscovered the value of loyalty forged over decades. The climax rejects both extremes. The countdown cannot be stopped without Thorne's intelligence, just as Thorne cannot survive long enough to finish without the protection provided by Barney, Christmas, Gunner, Doc, Galgo, and the rest of the veterans. The battlefield itself becomes a metaphor for collaboration across generations. At the center of the collapsing compound, however, one conflict remains unresolved. Barney finally confronts Conrad Stonebanks alone. The spectacle surrounding them gradually fades into the background as the film strips away helicopters, artillery, and armies, reducing the climax to two aging warriors confronting the consequences of choices made years earlier. Their duel begins with knives, the weapons most closely associated with Barney throughout the franchise, before descending into a savage combination of fists, blades, and raw determination. Neither man fights with elegant choreography. Every strike feels heavy, exhausting, and personal. Hughes emphasizes physical impact over stylistic flourish, allowing the duel to resemble two veterans forcing themselves beyond their limits through sheer willpower. What makes the confrontation compelling isn't simply its violence but its emotional foundation. Stonebanks repeatedly argues that Barney's loyalty is a weakness destined to destroy him. Barney, in contrast, has finally recognized that isolation, not loyalty, was his greatest mistake. Every punch exchanged reflects that ideological divide. They are no longer fighting over business, revenge, or survival alone. They are battling over two fundamentally different understandings of strength itself. Mel Gibson gives Stonebanks remarkable dignity even in defeat. He never begs for mercy or abandons his confidence. Instead, he continues believing his worldview until the very end, making him far more complex than a conventional action villain. Stallone answers with quiet resilience rather than triumphant celebration. Barney doesn't defeat Stonebanks because he becomes stronger. He wins because he has finally accepted the lesson his friends tried to teach him all along. No one carries impossible burdens forever without eventually breaking. As the final explosives threaten to consume the compound, Barney escapes the collapsing structure just moments before the entire facility erupts into a massive chain reaction. The destruction serves as more than visual spectacle. Symbolically, it buries the conflict that has haunted Barney since Stonebanks returned, allowing him to leave behind not only a dangerous enemy but also the guilt and misplaced responsibility that nearly destroyed him. The film wisely allows itself time to breathe afterward. Instead of ending amid smoke and rubble, it returns to the familiar comfort of the bar where so many relationships within the franchise have been strengthened over shared conversations and quiet celebrations. This setting carries different emotional weight now. Earlier, it became the place where Barney pushed his oldest friends away. Now it becomes the place where those same friends welcome new members into the family. The younger recruits are no longer outsiders assembled for convenience. They have earned their place through sacrifice, resilience, and loyalty under impossible circumstances. The veterans, meanwhile, no longer view them as replacements waiting to inherit the franchise. They recognize them as teammates whose different strengths ensure the Expendables can continue evolving without abandoning their identity. Laughter replaces tension, old rivalries soften into mutual respect, and the celebration feels less like the conclusion of a single mission than the healing of a fractured family. In the end, The Expendables 3 resolves its central conflict not through the defeat of Stonebanks alone, but through the realization that legends are not defined by refusing to change. They endure by discovering which traditions are worth preserving, which new ideas deserve embracing, and why neither the past nor the future can survive without the other. At first glance, Barney Ross appears to be chasing a straightforward objective. Conrad Stonebanks has resurfaced, innocent lives are at risk, and the mission demands that the former partner be captured before he can disappear again. It is the kind of external goal that has driven countless action heroes for decades. But beneath that familiar structure lies a far more personal conflict. Stonebanks is not merely another target on Barney's list. He is a living reminder of every decision, every loss, and every compromise that has shaped Barney into the man audiences have followed throughout the trilogy. Catching Stonebanks is the mission. Protecting the people Barney loves, and proving his own way of life still has value, is the battle that truly defines him. That distinction explains why Barney behaves so differently from traditional invincible action protagonists. Most heroes become more determined after failure. Barney becomes more isolated. The moment Hail Caesar is critically wounded, his attention shifts away from defeating the enemy and toward preventing further loss. It is not fear of death that drives him. Mercenaries accept death as part of the profession long before the story begins. His deepest fear is surviving while the people who trusted him do not. Leadership, in Barney's mind, is measured by responsibility rather than authority. Every teammate injured under his command becomes another burden he quietly carries, convincing himself that every tragedy could have been prevented had he made a different choice. This psychological pattern turns protection into emotional distance. Barney believes that pushing people away is an act of love, even if everyone around him experiences it as rejection. By dismissing the veteran Expendables after Caesar's injury, he convinces himself he is saving their lives. When he recruits a younger team, he frames the decision as practical adaptation, but it is equally an attempt to shield old friends from one final disaster. Later, after the Romanian mission collapses, the same instinct resurfaces when he prepares to rescue the captives alone. His solution to every emotional wound is isolation. If he fights by himself, then only he can be hurt. The tragedy is that this logic repeatedly denies others the chance to stand beside him willingly. Stonebanks recognizes that flaw almost immediately because he once shared Barney's worldview. Both men were forged by violence, but they responded to its emotional cost in opposite ways. Stonebanks abandoned attachment altogether, choosing self-preservation over loyalty. Barney refuses to abandon loyalty, yet still believes he must carry it entirely alone. The difference appears subtle, but it defines the moral divide between hero and villain. One rejects human connection. The other fears the consequences of it so deeply that he nearly destroys it himself. Sylvester Stallone's performance quietly strengthens these ideas through physical presence rather than dialogue. By the time The Expendables 3 arrived, Stallone was no longer portraying the unstoppable athlete of his earlier career. His movements carry visible weight. He walks with the confidence of experience instead of youthful speed, and every fight feels grounded in endurance rather than explosive athleticism. Rather than hiding age through frantic editing or exaggerated spectacle, the film often allows audiences to notice it. Barney pauses before standing. His punches require commitment. Recovery takes longer. These details are never presented as weakness. Instead, they communicate that survival leaves permanent marks on the body just as surely as it leaves scars on the mind. That physical reality also creates an intriguing layer of metatext. Barney Ross is an aging mercenary questioning whether he still belongs in a changing world. Stallone, meanwhile, was portraying the character at a moment when the era of star-driven action cinema was facing similar uncertainty. Without ever breaking the illusion of the story, the performance carries echoes of that larger cultural conversation. The quiet exhaustion visible in Barney's expressions often feels inseparable from decades of cinematic history resting on Stallone's shoulders. He is not merely playing a veteran soldier. He is embodying an entire generation of action heroes confronting an industry increasingly fascinated by superheroes, digital spectacle, and franchise brands rather than singular movie stars. That emotional resonance helps explain why Barney rarely delivers lengthy speeches. Stallone understands that silence has become one of the character's defining languages. A lingering glance toward an injured teammate communicates more than pages of dialogue. Moments spent watching others celebrate often reveal subtle melancholy beneath his composed exterior. The audience senses that Barney is constantly calculating risks, replaying failures, and wondering whether every successful mission simply postpones an inevitable goodbye. His stoicism is therefore not emotional emptiness but emotional restraint developed over years of refusing to burden others with his fears. Interestingly, the arrival of the younger recruits gradually exposes another side of Barney's personality. Initially, he recruits them because he believes they possess practical advantages against Stonebanks. As the story develops, however, his behavior increasingly resembles that of a reluctant mentor. He watches over them, worries about their safety, and instinctively places himself between them and danger. Although he never openly embraces the role, he begins acting less like a commander hiring disposable mercenaries and more like a father determined to keep younger people from repeating the painful lessons of his own generation. This transformation matters because it challenges Barney's long-held belief that leadership is defined solely by sacrifice. True leadership, the film suggests, also involves trust. A father cannot protect children forever by locking them away from risk, just as a commander cannot preserve teammates by refusing to fight beside them. The veterans ultimately remind Barney that strength grows through shared burdens rather than solitary endurance. Likewise, the younger recruits demonstrate that accepting guidance does not diminish their independence. Respect flows in both directions. By the conclusion of the film, Barney has not abandoned his protective instincts. If anything, they have become even stronger. What changes is his understanding of how protection actually works. Legacy is not preserved by refusing to let others participate. It survives through cooperation, mentorship, and the willingness to believe that different generations can strengthen one another instead of competing for relevance. In that sense, Barney Ross becomes more than the protagonist of an action sequel. He represents every veteran confronting the uncomfortable realization that time eventually changes both people and the worlds they helped build. His victory over Stonebanks is important, but his greater triumph lies in accepting that growing older does not require surrendering purpose. It simply demands discovering a new one, moving from solitary survivor to guardian, teacher, and finally the steady center of a family that can continue long after his own battles have ended. Great action heroes are rarely defined by the size of the explosions surrounding them. More often, they are defined by the person standing across from them. Throughout the Expendables series, Barney Ross has faced dictators, warlords, and criminal masterminds, but most of those enemies function primarily as obstacles. Conrad Stonebanks is something far more unsettling. He is not simply another mission waiting to be completed. He is the version of Barney Ross that might have existed had one crucial choice gone differently. That single idea transforms him from a conventional villain into the emotional center of the entire film. Long before the events of The Expendables 3, Stonebanks helped create the very organization Barney now leads. The Expendables were originally built around elite soldiers capable of surviving impossible assignments that ordinary militaries either could not or would not undertake. They operated in moral gray areas, accepting dangerous contracts while maintaining an internal code that separated them from ordinary criminals. At least, that was Barney's belief. Stonebanks eventually abandoned that distinction altogether, embracing the global arms trade and using violence not as a necessary tool but as a profitable business. The irony is impossible to ignore. Both men began their journeys on the same road. Only their destination changed. That shared history gives every encounter between them an intimacy rarely found in blockbuster action films. Barney doesn't spend the story discovering who Stonebanks is. He already knows him better than anyone else alive. Likewise, Stonebanks understands Barney's instincts, strengths, and weaknesses because they were forged together through years of shared experience. Every tactical move feels personal because both men are constantly anticipating what the other would naturally do. Their conflict therefore resembles less a battle between strangers and more an argument between former brothers whose lives have become incompatible. Mel Gibson's performance is the primary reason this dynamic succeeds so convincingly. Rather than portraying Stonebanks as constantly furious or theatrically evil, Gibson embraces calm confidence. His villain rarely appears rushed, intimidated, or emotionally overwhelmed. Even during moments when circumstances seem unfavorable, he behaves as though he has already calculated every possible outcome. That quiet certainty creates tension because audiences sense that Stonebanks is always thinking several moves ahead. He doesn't need to dominate a room through shouting. His composure accomplishes the same effect far more efficiently. At the same time, Gibson injects enough unpredictability into the character to prevent him from feeling mechanical. A slight smile can suddenly become a threat. Casual conversation can shift into psychological manipulation without warning. There is an unhinged charisma beneath Stonebank's professionalism, suggesting that years spent profiting from conflict have gradually eroded whatever empathy once existed. Unlike many cinematic villains who seek chaos for its own sake, Stonebanks values order. He simply believes that human lives are another resource to be bought, sold, and sacrificed whenever doing so increases his influence. This philosophy becomes especially compelling because the film refuses to pretend Barney occupies an entirely different moral universe. During their conversation inside the transport van, Stonebanks attacks the comfortable distinctions Barney has built around his own identity. The discussion unfolds almost like a courtroom debate rather than an interrogation. Stonebanks questions whether there is any meaningful difference between a mercenary accepting dangerous contracts and an arms dealer supplying the conflicts that make those contracts necessary. Both men profit from violence. Both operate outside conventional military structures. Both have spent years navigating morally ambiguous situations. If one claims to be righteous while condemning the other, where exactly does that moral certainty originate? It is perhaps the most intellectually engaging exchange in the entire trilogy because Stonebanks raises questions that cannot simply be dismissed. Action films often avoid examining the ethics of professional violence too closely, preferring clear divisions between heroes and villains. The Expendables 3 briefly allows those boundaries to blur. Barney cannot deny that his career has involved killing for money. He cannot claim to have lived an innocent life. Stonebanks understands this and deliberately targets the uncertainty hiding beneath Barney's stoic exterior. The crucial difference, however, emerges through motivation rather than occupation. Barney has always treated violence as a burden accepted in service of protecting others. Stonebanks treats it as an opportunity for personal advancement. One constantly worries about the consequences of his decisions, carrying guilt whenever teammates suffer. The other has eliminated guilt altogether because compassion interferes with efficiency. Their professions may appear similar from a distance, but their moral compasses point in opposite directions. The film wisely avoids presenting Barney as flawless. Instead, it argues that ethics are defined not only by what people do but also by the principles guiding those actions. Stonebanks therefore attacks something much deeper than Barney's physical safety. He threatens the story Barney tells himself about his own life. If the villain is correct, if there is no meaningful distinction between mercenary and arms dealer, then Barney's decades of sacrifice lose much of their moral foundation. Every mission becomes another transaction rather than an act of reluctant necessity. That possibility explains why Stonebanks unsettles Barney more profoundly than previous enemies. He forces the protagonist to defend not merely his tactics but his identity. Another fascinating aspect of Stonebanks is his refusal to romanticize the past. While Barney surrounds himself with lifelong friendships and remains fiercely loyal to old comrades, Stonebanks views nostalgia as weakness. Relationships become useful only while they provide strategic advantage. Once they stop serving that purpose, they can be discarded without hesitation. This worldview mirrors certain realities of modern corporate and criminal systems, where efficiency often replaces loyalty as the highest value. In many respects, Stonebanks represents an extreme version of ruthless pragmatism, a man who has adapted perfectly to a world driven by profit while abandoning every emotional bond that once made life meaningful. Mel Gibson's restrained performance prevents this philosophy from becoming cartoonish. Even at his most ruthless, Stonebanks rarely behaves like someone seeking destruction for pleasure alone. He genuinely believes he has outgrown Barney's outdated code. From his perspective, loyalty is sentimental, morality is negotiable, and survival belongs to those willing to evolve without emotional restraint. That conviction makes him dangerous because it contains a distorted kind of logic. Viewers may reject his conclusions, yet they can still understand how someone shaped by years of violence might arrive there. Ultimately, Conrad Stonebanks stands as the franchise's most compelling antagonist because defeating him requires more than superior firepower. Barney must first reject the cynical worldview Stonebanks offers as inevitable. The final battle therefore becomes philosophical as much as physical. Every punch exchanged represents two incompatible answers to the same lifelong question: what kind of person does endless violence create? Stonebanks insists it inevitably produces selfishness, greed, and moral compromise. Barney's journey argues that while violence leaves permanent scars, loyalty, responsibility, and human connection can still survive beneath them. That ideological struggle gives the Expendables 3 an emotional depth that extends well beyond its explosions, ensuring its greatest villain lingers in memory long after the smoke has cleared. If the Expendables 3 has one undeniable strength beyond its action sequences, it is the remarkable chemistry created whenever its enormous ensemble is allowed to simply exist together. Few action films have attempted to gather so many recognizable performers from different generations into a single story, and even fewer have succeeded in making the interactions between those personalities feel as entertaining as the explosions themselves. Yet the film also reveals the difficulty of managing such an ambitious cast. With so many characters competing for attention, every addition inevitably creates both memorable highlights and unavoidable sacrifices. The original Expendables continue functioning as the emotional foundation of the story because years of shared history are visible even when very little dialogue is exchanged. Barney Ross remains the quiet center around which everyone else naturally gravitates, but Lee Christmas once again serves as the team's emotional translator. Jason Statham understands that Christmas rarely challenges Barney through confrontation. Instead, he questions him through loyalty, standing close enough to disagree without ever abandoning the friendship. That subtle dynamic gives their relationship a lived-in authenticity that cannot be manufactured through exposition alone. Gunnar Jensen continues providing welcome unpredictability. Dolph Lundgren leans into the character's eccentric personality without reducing him to pure comic relief. Gunnar has always occupied an unusual position within the team. He is simultaneously one of its most dangerous members and one of its most emotionally unstable. That contrast keeps every conversation involving him slightly off balance, injecting spontaneity into a group otherwise defined by professional discipline. Randy Couture's Toll Road, meanwhile, remains deliberately understated. Rather than competing for attention, he strengthens the ensemble through reliability. Some supporting characters become memorable because they dominate scenes. Toll Road becomes memorable because he never disrupts the rhythm that allows everyone else to shine. Among all the newcomers to the veteran lineup, however, Antonio Banderas delivers the film's most unexpectedly delightful performance. Galgo initially appears almost overwhelming. He talks constantly, interrupts conversations, and radiates enough enthusiasm to exhaust both the audience and his fellow mercenaries. In another film, that level of energy might quickly become irritating. Banderas avoids that trap by grounding Galgo's endless optimism in genuine vulnerability. Every exaggerated story and every desperate attempt to impress the team reveals someone who simply longs to belong again. This emotional foundation transforms comedy into something surprisingly poignant. Galgo is funny because of his relentless persistence, but he is also quietly tragic because his excitement masks years spent waiting for another opportunity to prove his worth. Banderas plays those contrasting emotions with remarkable precision. One moment he floods the room with nervous chatter, and the next he allows a brief expression of disappointment to expose how deeply rejection affects him. By the time Barney finally accepts him as part of the mission, the audience understands that Galgo has already won something far more meaningful than another contract. He has rediscovered purpose. Wesley Snipes' return as Doc provides an entirely different kind of energy. Years away from major Hollywood productions never seem to diminish his screen presence. From the instant he appears during the prison train rescue, Doc projects effortless confidence, blending razor-sharp combat skills with a playful personality that distinguishes him from the franchise's more stoic veterans. His fighting style immediately recalls the athletic precision audiences associated with many of Snipes' earlier action performances. Instead of relying solely on overwhelming force, Doc moves with speed, agility, and technical finesse, making every encounter feel fluid rather than brutal. Equally important is his chemistry with Jason Statham. Their exchanges carry an easy rhythm built around mutual respect and understated humor. Neither actor tries to dominate the other. Instead, they trade dry remarks and confident glances that suggest two professionals instantly recognizing familiar talent. Even brief conversations enrich the team dynamic because Doc introduces a lighter tone without undermining the seriousness of the mission. His self-aware joke about tax evasion may be the most obvious example, but his relaxed confidence continues influencing the ensemble long after that memorable introduction. Harrison Ford faces perhaps the most unusual challenge within the cast. Replacing Bruce Willis after such a public departure could easily have invited constant comparison, yet Ford wisely avoids imitation altogether. Max Drummer functions differently from Willis's church, emphasizing calm authority over mysterious detachment. Ford rarely raises his voice or indulges in exaggerated heroics. His confidence emerges through measured decisions, dry humor, and the unmistakable credibility he brings simply by appearing on screen. When he eventually joins the action from the cockpit of an attack helicopter, the moment feels satisfying precisely because the film has resisted overusing him beforehand. His restrained presence allows his eventual participation to carry genuine impact. The younger recruits present a more complicated picture. John Smiley, Luna, Thorne, and Mars all contribute valuable skills that support the narrative's central theme of generational transition. Individually, however, they receive far less psychological development than their veteran counterparts. Glenn Powell's Smiley projects charismatic confidence and hints at the rebellious charm that would later define many of the actor's performances, yet the screenplay never fully explores his motivations beyond professional competence. Ronda Rousey's Luna effectively demonstrates physical capability and determination, offering a welcome reminder that modern action teams no longer depend exclusively on male heroes. Thorne contributes technological expertise that becomes essential during the climax, while Mars reinforces the disciplined professionalism expected from elite operatives. Collectively, these younger characters function more as symbolic archetypes than fully realized individuals. Each represents a particular aspect of contemporary warfare: technical intelligence, athletic adaptability, disciplined training, or youthful confidence, but only rarely do they receive the quieter moments necessary to establish distinctive inner lives. This limitation reflects one of the film's biggest structural challenges. With so many legendary actors already demanding attention, creating equally memorable arcs for four entirely new protagonists becomes nearly impossible within a single runtime. Interestingly, this imbalance also reinforces the audience's emotional perspective. Viewers naturally arrive carrying decades of familiarity with Stallone, Statham, Snipes, Ford, Lundgren, and Banderas. The newcomers, by comparison, begin with far less cultural history attached to them. The film attempts to bridge that gap through action rather than characterization, hoping competence will earn affection. While the strategy succeeds functionally, it never quite generates the same emotional investment inspired by the veterans. Even so, the ensemble ultimately succeeds because its strongest relationships are built upon contrast rather than similarity. Quiet personalities collide with energetic ones. Old instincts meet modern techniques. Dry humor interrupts moments of tension, while genuine affection quietly emerges beneath professional discipline. Instead of presenting one generation as superior, the film gradually reveals that every member contributes something the others cannot. The legends provide experience, loyalty, and identity. The younger recruits supply fresh perspectives and evolving skills. Characters like Galgo and Doc bridge those worlds through optimism and adaptability, while Max Drummer anchors the operation with measured authority. Together, they create an ensemble that may not distribute attention equally, but consistently reminds audiences why watching extraordinary personalities share the same screen remains one of the franchise's greatest pleasures. Beneath its relentless explosions and oversized action set pieces, The Expendables 3 is driven by an unexpectedly reflective question: what happens when the qualities that once made someone extraordinary no longer guarantee survival? Every major conflict in the film ultimately circles back to that idea. The enemy is not simply Conrad Stonebanks or his private army. It is time itself. The story asks whether experience can remain valuable in a world that increasingly rewards speed, technology, and constant reinvention over hard-earned wisdom.